Okay, good morning. It's very nice to be here. Here's the plan. We all have to write, the big part of the fabric of doing research is writing papers. And if you look at papers, you'll find that lots of them are a bit incomprehensible, a bit hard to make sense of. And what I wanted to suggest to you is 7 simple things that you can do that will raise, your own game and make your papers better, easier to understand, and more publishable, which is all good. Now, this is something about which nobody has a monopoly on truth. So I'm going to tell you what works for me, right? It may not work for you, but also some of you will have written papers already or will have some experience of your own. And I'd like to encourage you not to sit very passively and politely until the end before, the marks off research, but rather to engage in some kind of dialogue as we go. So you can ask questions, or you can just make comments and say, so this, I do something different here, and because my field is different. Another thing that can be different is that different fields have different conventions. So, bioinformatics might be rather different, and climate modeling might be rather different to my field of computer science. So, but the principal target that I'm going to address is the framework of a kind of 12-page conference paper in ACM, 2-column format. But most of what I say will apply to any paper that you might write. But that's my sort of primary target. I think it's easy to focus on one thing to begin with. Okay, so you're ready. 7 things. So here's number 1. When we write papers, we often think that we should sort of do our research like this. You first of all have some kind of idea, and then you do a research, you do a PhD, and towards the end you think, right, now I've worked everything out, I can write the paper. That only seems sensible, right? Do the work, then write the paper. This is utterly wrong, right? Nobody should do this. This is what you should do, right? First of all, you have some kind of microscopic idea. Then you start to write the paper, and that tells you the research that you need to do. So the act of articulating something in writing, even if only for yourself, is incredibly helpful in crystallizing your ideas and sort of forcing you to write them clearly enough so that you know whether they make sense or not. Right? And it's not uncommon to, if you follow this model, it's not uncommon to get to the end, be writing the paper, it's only 6 weeks before the conference deadline, and you discover there's a whole pile of work that you haven't done that you should have done to write this paper, and there's a whole pile of work that you did do that was irrelevant for this paper, right? So this plan makes it much more task-focused. You sort of start to focus on writing a paper, and then it's like lazy evaluation for functional programmers, right? You sort of have to work on the bits that are needed to deliver the results. Does that make sense, right? So the other really good thing about writing early is that it gives you something you can talk to other people about. So when you interact with other people, research is a sort of community effort. It's not really conducted by monks in their cells, each working individually for years. Occasionally, but not typically. It's more of a community thing. And this is the mechanism of communication in a community. Now, if you write some kind of draft of a paper that's not finished yet, then, okay, you're not going to publish it in a journal, but you might share it with a few of your research colleagues to say, here's what I'm thinking about, does this make sense? So it gives you something so much more concrete to discuss with your colleagues. Okay? So it's a pretty simple idea, really. Just start writing early. So, you have to have something to write about, but don't wait very long. A month or 2 is long enough before you can start writing something. It doesn't have to be for a journal or for a conference. It can just be something to help you get your ideas straight. So I just want to articulate the idea that the act of writing is not a kind of output of the research. It's part of the fabric of doing research. It's the main forcing function that I use. I think it casts your writing in a different frame when you think about it in this way. So far, so good? So that's pretty simple, right? That's number 1. Yeah?
For some people, this might be the least pleasant part of the research, writing the papers. And in the case that you're writing the paper and nothing comes out of it, then it might seem like a waste of effort and a waste of time doing something.
Right, so writing may be hard, right? And your point is that if it turns out that nothing comes out of it, then it was a waste. I don't think it's a waste, right? So I would suggest, for example, you might spend 6 months working on that dead end, and then discover that it was a dead end, whereas if you'd spent a month starting to write, you might have discovered it earlier, right? So the writing forces to the surface the fact that maybe this is not very productive line. So I don't know. So I can't deny that writing is sometimes difficult, but in my heart, I think it's really worth it. The trade-off is a good one, if you like. Yeah.
How about if I replace your early writing with, let's say, a PowerPoint presentation in which I tell people about my work?
So you could, writing. So the question is, couldn't you write a PowerPoint presentation instead of writing paper? That's fine too. Yes. You tend to be a bit less detailed, so there's more of a danger that you might skate over the dodgy bits, right, and deceive yourself. We have great capacity for self-delusion, right? Saying, oh yeah, I understand that. Well, when you write the paper, you discover you don't understand it. So there's a bit more danger of that. But yeah, anything to articulate it so that both you and other people can appreciate it. Yes?
From a very practical point of view, what I found has worked for me
Yes.
is making a Google Doc or a Microsoft whatever. Filling out an introduction, motivation, evaluation, sort of headings.
Great, yeah.
And then I put in a couple of dot points.
Yeah.
This is kind of what I'm thinking. But the nice thing about using a shareable whatever is that it means that I can then share it with all of the people I'm
Yeah.
closest working with, and they can add comments and things. And this helps. Firstly, it's kind of the skeleton which the paper is going to eventually hang off of. But it also means that immediately we're feeding back against each other. And when I say, I think we can evaluate it this way, they say that's a terrible idea because it will never work. And that's really early on in the process. I haven't looked at building anything yet. We're just sort of hanging the skeleton off.
Good. So you're a slightly different mechanism for articulating ideas and sharing them, and by making them concrete and invisible. Yeah, that's right. All good. Yes. Okay, so that's number one. Here's number two, right? Which is, here I said this, what about this idea bit at the beginning? So it's very important in a paper to know what the idea is, at least by the time you've finished. So what is the purpose of writing a paper? Here is the purpose. It is to convey a reusable insight or idea from your brain into the mind of, what's your name? Matt, right. So from my brain into Matt's brain. So my paper is kind of like a virus that is carrying this infectious idea out of my brain, and it's going to infect Matt's neurons, and soon he's going to be able to think of nothing else, and then he's going to tell his friends, and they'll tell their friends, and soon my idea is going to have infected the world. Right? So the paper is a way of conveying ideas. That's its primary mechanism. I'm using Mozart as my example here because Mozart's ideas were so incredibly seductive and compelling that hundreds of years after he's died, we go to concert halls to hear people read his papers. Right? So long after we are dust, long after the artifacts that we build are dust. I mean, computer science is a very constructive engineering kind of subject as well as a scientific one. So we build things. But long after the things we build are dust, the ideas that we develop will hopefully still live on in some way. Right? So the kind of reuse, and I stress reusable because novelty of itself is of little value in computer science. Right? Simply to have something to be new is not important. It's got to be new and somehow useful. Computer science is like a fractal. It's like a snowflake. Everywhere you study, it ramifies ahead of you. So it's easy to find new territory, right? But you just invent it out of thin air. But it's new territory which is of great interest to you and maybe no interest to anybody else. So it must have some utility. Unlike, say, physics, where if you discover something new, that is a fact about the world. So it is of interest to other people. And this last point is just that however clever you are, however brilliant you are, if you sit in a windowless black box and generate great ideas but don't tell anybody, you might as well not have done it, right? You're just generating heat. You're sort of increasing entropy in the universe. So it's worth, you actually need to communicate. Because otherwise you might as well not have bothered. Now, so once you've got this idea, you then need to know sort of what it is. When you finish writing your paper, when you begin writing your paper, it may be a bit hard to articulate exactly what your key idea is. But by the time you've finished, you should be in no doubt, and you should leave your readers in no doubt as well. I can't tell you how many reviews that I've written of papers. As a reviewer, I've written in the review, I believe that the key insight of this paper is blah, 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 blah. A reviewer should never have to write that. The author should say, the key insight of this paper is blah, 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 blah. So do signpost very clearly when you get to your key idea. And if you have lots of ideas, Don't try to slam them into a single paper, so then it becomes like, you know, a sort of concentrated high vitamin diet all squished together with a clamp, right? Then it's very indigestible. If you have lots of ideas, that's cool, right? Lots of papers, right? So don't try to overpack a particular paper. So, and this is just saying that this is about signposting. Make sure that you know and your readers know what the idea is. So this is a good litmus test to apply to your paper at a late-ish stage. Well, you can apply it at every stage, but you don't be too hard on yourself to begin with, right? But also apply it to papers that you read. When you read a paper, think to yourself, what is the key idea in this paper? What do I take away, a sort of reusable insight? Most papers are jam full of detail and Greek symbols and technical complexity and tables of measurement and who knows what kind of carry-on, right? But when you read the paper, if it's a really good paper, you'll come away with something, oh, that's a clever idea, I wish I'd thought of that, right? So you can apply that discipline to yourself when you read papers, and then that will give you a greater sense of what other readers would like to find in your papers when you write them. Does that make sense? But so if you read a paper and you think, actually, I've got a clue what the key idea is, that's not your fault, that's the author's fault. Right? Okay? So knowing what the key idea is very, very important. It sort of dominates everything else. One other thing about the key idea, yes?
Sometimes something comes out of combining 1, 2, or 3 ideas.
Yes. So sometimes there are fruitful combinations. Well,
then
then maybe you do have to put more than one thing in. But then perhaps the key idea is the combination of these two does more than you would expect. You know, so and perhaps that's a bit surprising somehow. So you know, A plus B is 1 plus 1 is more than 2. That's kind of what you're suggesting here. So say that too. Don't just lay them out, 1, 2, 3, oh, ho, hum, right? You say, oh, 1, 2, 3, amazing, 7. Highlight it, yeah. Yep.
So sometimes you have an idea which is, you know, it is new, but it is a very, very tiny kind of addition.
Yes.
It seems like too little for an idea.
Oh, very good question. You segued right into this thing, right?
Right.
So you have an idea, but it seems like a very tiny idea. You read other people's papers. They have good ideas, right? Oh, they're full of insight, and you think, wow, how amazing. They must have brains the size of small asteroids. I'm a mere pitiful worm, and my ideas are pitiful and insignificant, and nobody would possibly be interested in them, right? Everybody feels this. Even the people whose papers you are reading and that seem so impressive, they felt like that to begin with, at least if they're in the sort of the 90th percent. Maybe there's a sort of top 10% who are so self-confident they don't have a moment of self-doubt. But believe me, they are in the minority. So the truth is that what you must do is you must start to write about any idea, no matter how weedy and pitiful it may seem. Now, sometimes it will turn out that it is indeed weedy and pitiful, in which case writing the paper won't take very long and you haven't lost much. But my consistent experience, which I'll just feed back to you for what it's worth, is that much, much more often you take something that seems to be fairly straightforward and you start to work out the details and to think about interactions with other things, and it turns out to be more complicated than you thought. It turns out to be worth 12 pages of 2-column format, not 2 pages of that. Maybe not a book, but a conference paper size idea. So that happened to me fairly recently, you know, like only 9 months ago, I was writing a paper with an intern, and it was kind of, we thought, oh, this will be the warm-up project for this intern. It's kind of pretty easy, we'll knock it off in a couple of weeks. You know, 11 weeks later, we were still going, and we did end up writing a paper about it. That initially I thought, oh, well, you know, we better document this. It's not very hard. But then it turned out it was more complicated than we thought. Ended up in the one of the top programming languages conferences. So this is still happening to me, right? After I regret to tell you how many years of doing computer science. You sort of start with something weedy, and you end up with something interesting. I can't give you that confidence. You'll build that sense of confidence after you've done it for a while. Just let me encourage you to believe for a moment that it is worth writing, even about insignificant ideas. Sometimes it won't work. Sometimes they'll turn out to be insignificant, and then you just leave it as an unpublished note on your homepage, right? You don't have to publish everything. That's fine, right? You just say, here's something, a little something I did. It's not very big, but but I did write about it, and here it is. Okay. So much about the idea then. So just repeating. So 2 things. Write early and identify your key idea. Okay, so the 3rd thing I wanted to talk about was to do what to do once you're starting to write your paper. So, let's see, on Thursday you're going to have a talk from, what's his name, David Newman. David Newman. He's going to give you talks about presentation skills, and he's going to tell stories. Now, he's going to tell you about telling stories about sort of anecdotes about people. This is a different kind of story that I'd like to tell. Here's the story that I try to tell in my papers. I like to say, my model is, if I take a friend, what's your name? Marco. If I take Marco, and sorry about my R's, which are not very good, and I say, I've got 5 minutes with you, and I want to sort of tell you a bit about what I'm doing, then what am I going to do? I'm going to walk up to a whiteboard, and I'm going to sort of sketch a quick, a couple of examples of something and say, look, here's an interesting problem, and here's the kind of way I'm tackling it. I'm not going to give you theorems. I'm not going to write definitions and things. I'm going to do this kind of thing. Here's a problem. It's an interesting problem. It's an unsolved problem. And here is some intuition about my idea, right? So and if I do this to you in person, you can think about the kind of storyline that you would do. Or those of you who are presenting posters, you've been thinking about how to do a kind of, a 5-minute capsule summary of your story about what you're up to. And you've tried to put that on your poster, and you'll doubtless over lunch be explaining it to people as you go. I want you to think about your paper in the same way, just at slightly greater length. So here is, your storyline. What you want your reader to think is, on page 1, they think, well, I can see that's a problem, and I have the vaguest idea about how they're solving it, but it's certainly, if they could deliver on these claims, that would be interesting. Maybe I'll turn the page and read page 2. And then you say, it's a bit more detail about the idea. I kind of see how that might work, but there's a lot of details I'm not sure about. Maybe I'll look a bit further. Do you see what I mean? So you're drawing them in bit by bit, rather than hitting them with difficult stuff right away. And then, of course, the my idea works details and data stuff, that's the bulk of your paper, to be sure. This is not, word counts here. And then a bit about related work, which I have more to say about. So this is my overall plan for a story for a paper. All right? And here's how it kind of breaks down in size, for me, size and readership. So the title is read by a lot of people, the abstract by rather fewer, the first page by rather fewer, and the rest of it by virtually nobody. All right? So proportionately. So what does this tell you? This tells you should invest a lot in your first page. Now, a title's a bit tongue-in-cheek, right? So don't over-invest in making snazzy titles, but do try to make your titles informative enough so that somebody flicking through the proceedings is going to realize when it's about something that they're interested in. But this first page thing, I think, is really important. I want to say quite a bit more about what to write on your first page, because your readership drops off very sharply after the first page, I think. And lots of people take a look at the beginning of a paper and then move on quickly. So I want to say a little bit about some of these pieces, but I think starting with the introduction. And so the introduction here, this page is going to be read by most people. What's going to be in the introduction? Well, it's going to say something about what the problem is and why it's important, and something about what the contributions of your paper are. So this 4th point is about identifying your contributions. So on your first page, you have to say something about the problem you're trying to solve. Otherwise, your contributions to it wouldn't be at all clear. So you do have to set the scene somehow. But you want to fit all of this on a page, not of a journal with tiny pages. You can't hope to do this on a page, but a sort of the A4 size conference format. You can get a lot on the first page, and it's worth really trying to do that. Now I want to say a bit about what I mean by contributions, because that's the sort of key part here. So here's an example of a paper that I wrote. Here's my first couple of paragraphs that are describing the problem. And I'm not describing the problem in general terms. I'm describing a particular concrete instance of a problem. Oh, I beg your pardon. So I've mislaid myself. I want to talk about contributions, but I want to say a little bit about this describe the problem bit, because this is a place where people often go wrong. And this is the way in which they go wrong. They describe an overambitious problem. Right? So supposing you come across an ant, and the ant says to you, here is my life's work. I'm going to climb Mount Everest. Right? And you think, ant, you are never going to climb Mount Everest. It may be a good goal. Many people are working on it. But there's no point in really reading your paper about climbing Mount Everest, because the most you're going to get up is a tiny boulder or two on the way. So here's an example of the kind of introduction you sometimes see in papers that outlines some vast research area that has occupied hundreds of researchers for thousands of man-years. And you say, that's what this paper is about. So when you read this kind of stuff, right, many programs have bugs and it's important to eliminate them. And does that make the blood pulse in your veins? Do you think, yes, this is the paper that I want to read in this proceedings? It's a bit yawny, isn't it? You yawn and say, okay, yeah, sure, I know that. Right, that motherhood and apple pie. Nobody could possibly disagree with this claim. But if you have a more focused claim, right, here is a particular program that has an interesting bug in it, and you say, I'm going to show you how to detect not just this bug, but a whole class of similar bugs, and you can kind of perhaps informally characterize what that class is. Now you're encouraging your reader to believe that you have an achievable goal here, one that you might actually deliver in the scale of this paper. Does that make sense? So that's why I say molehills, not mountains. If you describe a mountain, people will yawn. If you describe a sugar cube, they may yawn as well. You want to describe something in the middle that seems achievable. On page 1, okay? So don't waste page 1 writing down motherhood and apple pie statements that nobody could disagree with. The page 1 words are your sort of golden words where you have a big readership. Don't waste those words. Okay? All right, so then I wanted to go back, let me go back to contributions then. So you've described your idea and you've given some idea that it might be achievable, and now you're going to say what this paper delivers. Now, most papers do something like this. A surprisingly large minority fail to state their contributions explicitly at all. They just say introduction. They treat it as a kind of general introduction to the area. And you're expected, by the time you finish reading the paper, you might have figured out what its contributions are. But no, on page 1, you must, I think, state the payload. You say, what is the reader going to get if they read this paper, right? So it's kind of like a specification, and the rest of the paper is like the implementation. So what you're trying to do is to make the reader think, oh, if the author could deliver on her promises that she makes on page 1, then this would be a paper well worth reading. And that at least encourages you to go on, right? Go on and reading. I always use bullets for this. So this is just my style. But I like this because it forces me as an author to be completely explicit about what my contributions are. So, some blah, 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 introduction, state problem, blah, blah, and then finally I say, and now we're going to get to the contributions. I may say contributions, I may say some sentence like this, firm a basis, and then I list out, claim 1. Think of them as claims. First claim, second claim, third claim. Just list them out. You must not leave your reader to guess what these claims are going to be. You must make the claim. Okay, and when you're making claims, try to make them refutable claims. In science, it's not very interesting to study hypotheses that cannot be refuted or that are obviously true. So here's an example. In your contribution, say, we are going to describe a type system and we're going to study its properties. Of course you're going to study its properties, right? What has the reader learnt from those precious words on the front page? Nothing. This is not a claim that could possibly be refuted. Whereas if you state, I'm going to prove that it's sound and type checking is decidable, these are admitted by now using somewhat technical language, but the people in that area will know what you mean, and they say, okay, so he's going to prove some refutable facts about the type system that he's produced, right? And I've got a couple of other examples here, just of the kind of things that you often see on page 1 and the kind of things I would prefer to see. So think of it like celery rather than overcooked spaghetti. Celery has crunch, right? You bite it and you go, right? So you want a crunchy first page, not a soggy first page. All right? Yes?
But if you just achieve something that everybody desires, then there's nothing to refute.
If you have just achieved, well, even the very fact that you're saying if you've achieved something that everybody wants.
A concert.
Well,
like a verified C compiler.
Oh, okay. So you might say, so this is I have verified a C compiler. Well, that's a very that's a sort of overarching kind of statement. I mean, it does actually describe a 10 or 12-year research project conducted by dozens of people, but nevertheless. So in a paper, you might say, specifically, we have a machine-supported proof of a compiler for a subdialect of C that all the way from the ASCII source code to the machine code. So you could be a bit more specific about what it is, and you could say we have the machine-supported proof goes from front to back. So now you've articulated the claim in rather more detail, and almost certainly there's sub-detail in there that you could articulate. You might say. In proving the optimizer, we had to invent a completely new proof technique that we had never really seen before. It's described in section 3, and it works roughly like this. So you've almost certainly got sub-achievements that you might want to identify within which your overall. So try to identify the pieces. Yeah. So the fact that it's a goal that everybody would like to achieve, that's good, right? That doesn't make it a non-refutable claim. Your claim is that you might not have done it quite as thoroughly or reproducibly as you claim. We do, yeah. Yep.
How many bullets you should have when you enumerate?
Oh, how many bullets should you have? So this varies a lot. So some of my papers I have 2 or 3. Some it's more like 7 or 8. I would seldom have 10 or 12. That kind of, yeah.
How does this go with having one idea per paper? Because obviously one of the bullets is the main idea, but the others should be evaluation.
Yes. So this is a good question. So how can you have many contributions but only one idea, right? So I think often you're right. There's some grey area here. I think what you'd find is that there's a sort of motivating force or factor around the idea. But to say this idea really works often requires little contributions of one kind or another. I don't think you'll find that's difficult in practice. But I do think that let's see, this is sometimes what you find at the end of the section at the beginning, right? At the end of the introduction, you have a paragraph that says the rest of this paper is structured as follows. Do you love reading those paragraphs? When you get to that point in the paper, do you think, aha? What do? You skip it. Where is this paragraph? On page 1. So you're inflicting this paragraph, which everybody is going to skip, on your maximal readership. Why are you doing this? This is a self-inflicted injury that many papers make. Now, of course, it seems sensible, right, to give your readership a roadmap, but actually there are better ways to do it. I've shown you some here. So I make my list of contributions have forward references, right? So for every claim, this is really what I want to say, each claim forward references the evidence for that claim, right? So when I claim that type system, I say section 4, that's where if you, the reader, want to verify that I've delivered on this promise, go look in section 4. And now the list of contributions serves, and you can see another example here, not necessarily in order, section 4, 5, and 6, and 7. So, it's not, the sections don't necessarily appear in order, but there's some kind of narrative story for these contributions that, inter alia, among other things, gives you a roadmap for the paper. Does that make sense? It's a great way of subliminally giving this structure without actually doing this kind of nonsense, which is a total waste of space.
It seems that can give a more explicit roadmap of the paper length.
This is a fully explicit roadmap, yes. But is it ever useful to you as a reader, honestly?
I think it might be. I think also it's useful sometimes to write it, even.
Well, you can write it and then it's commented out later. Or sometimes on long journal papers, I sometimes do find long journal papers sometimes come with a pictorial roadmap. They say section 3, there's an arrow to section 7. You must read section 3 before section 7. There's some sort of complex interdependencies among a larger piece of work, or perhaps a thesis, right? You might have some interesting interdependencies. So then, and that really looks like a map, right, with spatially laid out. That can be quite useful. But in a smaller compass, I don't think that's so important. That's my opinion. So maybe there are probably occasions when you should ignore this rule, but I encourage it. But because it's so much the norm to do this, I'm encouraging you to question that norm seriously. And only do it if it's really paying its way. Yes?
Can I do some map would help me to pinpoint which section I need exactly.
Right.
If I need the paper, I don't need to read the whole paper. I
Uh-huh.
notice it maybe in one of the sections. So this part
So it helps you to
help me just the
helps you to
entire-
find the bit that you need. Yeah. So I think so. My claim is that you can more or less do that purpose with your contributions bullets, right? And moreover, because this section always feels like a bit of an overhead, it's usually too short to do. Each section is described very briefly, so it's hard to know if that's a section. Whereas in a list of contributions here, you've got a few more words, so it's easy. So I think that's the place to do for my money. Okay, so yeah.
Typically in computer systems papers, what you have is like a list of contributions, which is like, here is our key insight, that's one bullet, one contribution.
Yeah.
The other contribution is we design a system around the inside.
Mm-hmm.
The third is like we implement the system around, based on the design. The fourth is we evaluate it. And the fifth bullet is we discuss a little bit about it, right? So, it's a single contribution of that paper, which is kind of broken down in, like, there are five contributions, which are basically a single one. I would actually, these are, in my opinion, not contributions of this paper.
Right, the real contribution was the key insight.
Basically, you should list them as your contributions.
Ah,
I don't
so
think that the contribution counts, counts much. Right.
So I would say try to figure out what you think the contributions are, right, and write down those. Don't just fluff them out with more to make it look good. Just figure out what you think your contributions are.
I don't want it to be the table of content, right?
So I agree. Write the narrative and hang the contents on that if you can. So for example, if I have a related work section, I don't put that in the list. One of my contributions is that I have related work. No, I don't do that. I do add a little note often after the contributions bit to say very briefly, one line. I say, we discuss related work in section 8. Kind of, it's not a contribution, but I just mention it so that the reader's going to know where I'm going to find that kind of thing. So don't think of it primarily as a contents list. Think of it primarily as a list of contributions and hang however many forward references you can off that. That's all I can say. Another good thing about doing this is that if you find a section that is not referenced at all, you might question whether it belongs there at all. Often it does. You need some background work or some mathematical notation or something, but not always. Sometimes it can be like dead code elimination, right? There's a whole section you wrote that turns out not to be delivering the payload of the paper. Fine. Take it out and put it in another paper when it is contributing. Yeah?
Having expressive section titles helps quite a bit too.
Yes.
It's easy to sort of scan through and see the large, bold letters
Yeah.
in a paper without having to read them. And so even if you don't list all of your sections, maybe in your contributions point, having a big related work title at the end is pretty explicit.
Right. So you're saying that the titles themselves form a roadmap that's pretty easy to find flicking through. Yes. And actually, in some ways, easier to find than this very dense little paragraph like this. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I saw a paper from some MIT folks recently, and it's probably fairly specific to systems, but I really liked their structure. And it's
Can everybody hear, by the way, because you're right at the front? Can you hear at the back? So talk loudly.
To what you're suggesting, but what they did was they said, thank you. What they did is they said, foo is an interesting problem. All of the existing solutions suffer from the following things, 1, 2, 3.
Mm-hmm.
And then they said, our system, whatever, is much better, and it has the following properties, 1, 2, 3, forward references to the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the first page, essentially.
Great.
But the really nice thing about it was it was in itself a summary of the entire paper. It was kind of the related work, although it was only 3 sentences, and it was kind of all of the contributions, although it was only 3 sentences. And from just reading that front page, you got the entire paper crammed in, more or less, in a very neat way. Having seen that, I mean, it only really applies to places where you have this kind of big body of background work that is all contributing to the same sort of problem. But it's similar to this, but it was the nicest format that I've seen in any paper I've read. And when I read it, I went, "Oh, great! I get exactly what you guys have done." Mm-hmm. And the rest of the paper sort of followed directly from that. So I just thought I'd add that as a nice way of doing things.
That's a good comment. Thank you. And do think about what you want to do is have a first page which somebody gets something from all by itself. It's not just some flannel which they have to wade through to get to your paper. What you'd like is for your reader to, even if they stop at the end of page 1, you'd like them to take something away with them. That's a good metric to apply to papers. Wherever somebody leaves the train, do they take something useful away with them? Or do they only get to the juice, the payload, if they wade through mountains of swamp, oceans of swamp? Okay? I want to mention one other thing that papers often do, right? Not just this, it's even worse. Related work. So it seems like good scholarship, right? You're about to undertake you've identified a problem, and the first thing you should do is to say, we stand on the shoulders of giants, and you should describe in detail all the work that has gone before. It's a disaster. When you have somebody in front of a whiteboard, and you say, you're my friend, I want to, I've got Marco in front of my whiteboard, right? Do I begin by giving him a 5-minute lecture on related work before I get to the stuff? Of course not. So it's damaging in all sorts of ways. One thing is that you don't have enough intellectual scaffolding to understand it yet because they haven't read the paper, right? So experts may understand this kind of gibberish that you often find in related work sections, but the bulk of your readership will not. And the paper isn't, you want to address more than just the core experts in your paper. You'd like to convey this idea to people who are not already experts in this particular field. The other thing is that because it feels as if it's getting in the way of getting to the payload, related work sections often start at 2.5 pages, and then a process of squishing takes place, in which every alternate word is omitted, and sentences are crafted to be shorter and more cryptic, until you have this sort of dense, incomprehensible gibberish that nobody can understand, even the experts. So the bad thing is that it doesn't do your readers any good, right? It makes them feel stupid because they read this stuff and they think, this is only page 2. I'm supposed to be understanding this and I haven't a clue what is going on, right? And also, if they do take the trouble to try to figure it out, they feel tired. So they're exhausted before they get to the main idea. So in effect, what you've done is you've placed a sort of concrete wall between your reader and the main payload of your paper, which is your idea. So what to do? Because after all, what we cannot do is to pretend that there is no related work. No. So what you want to do is to just put it at the end, right? So by the time you get to the end, you have a lot more intellectual scaffolding. You've introduced examples, you've introduced intuitions, you've described something about your work. You have much, much more background to work with when you're describing. Moreover, in introducing related work there, you can compare it with your own. Whereas at the beginning, you can't, because you haven't introduced your own yet. And I have read related work sections at the beginning that attempt to do a comparison with the not yet presented idea of the work. It's just a disaster. Now, this is not to say that, the two things this is not saying. The first is, it's not saying do not have any references to anybody else until you get to the end. As you present stuff, you should make references to other people's work. So you could say, in developing this idea, we follow the ideas of, of green and white, bracket see section 8, in doing this. So what you give the expert reader says, I knew that, the green and white had this an idea like this. But I see he's going to address that a little later. That's fine, right? So you've given a forward reference that reassures the expert reader that it will be covered without distracting the non-expert reader who thinks, that's fine, I don't care about green and white, I just care about the payload. Okay? The other thing that it's not saying is that sometimes, in order to get to your idea, you need to present some background material, right, to sort of lead them up to it, right? So when I'm with Marco on my whiteboard, in order to get Marco to the point at which he is able to contemplate the full glory of my idea, I have to help him a little bit by giving a sort of tutorial to, in the background that gets up to the point. But the goal there is, I'm giving the tutorial to Marco. It's not to enumerate all the related work. Now, in giving the tutorial, of course you should mention, cite all the people whose work you are in effect describing, and again give forward references to section 8 where it'll be discussed in more detail or compared. But your goal is the tutorial with side references to related work. Does that make sense? And this is flatly contradictory to at least some common practice, and even to some explicit guidance from some of your advisors and supervisors, I suspect, right? So you may have to fight on this one, and in the end you'll have to do what your advisor says, but you can fight hard, right? Fight hard. Yeah.
Surely there is a reason that this is common practice. Can you think of
Oh, what is the reason that this is common practice? I think there are, I mean, the reason is, I suppose, just that it seems like good scholarship, doesn't it? First you describe, the status quo, and then you describe your increment on it. It's just, and you are going to, by the time you finish the paper, you are going to have done that. So this is purely a presentational thing. So I think the fact that it's common practice presentationally, I don't think really does have a good justification, no, in my humble and entirely unbiased opinion. Yeah?
There are quite a few papers where they have both related work and background sections as two
Yeah.
separate sections.
So the background at the beginning, related work at the end, yeah. No, I think that's fine. But the purpose of background is not to enumerate everything that's gone before. The purpose of background is to set the reader up so that they can appreciate your idea. End of story. That's the purpose of background. Okay? That's all you've got to remember. Because you're trying to lead them to that point by the shortest possible path. Somebody else. Yeah.
Do you think there's a disconnect between writing papers, I guess, for people to read them and writing papers that reviewers will like? Because I can see one of the reasons you put the related work first is, no, this really is novel. Don't spend the rest of the paper sort of thinking there's nothing to it. And by the time you get to the end of the paper, you just sort of have a bitter taste in your mouth.
No, I think you can. I think you can make claims to novelty right there in the contributions, right? And in your background section, you can make claims to, here's some unsolved problems. So you make those claims with forward references again, so avoid distraction, but make the claim. So I don't think you need to amplify that claim to novelty too early. Just make it. Yeah.
So how you combine like introductions with the related works? Like you don't have the related works at all, but you combine them into your introductions. Would that be a good idea?
So if you don't have related work at all.
Yeah, so you put the related work in your introductions. Would that be work out or?
Oh, I would never put related work in the introduction. Whoa. So that would be kind of like, remember the introduction is my precious single page. I don't want to use my single page on this, right? It's the good scholarship bit that isn't key to understanding the idea, but is key to understanding how it fits in the landscape of computer science. All right. Reasonable people can differ about this, but I feel it quite strongly, so I'll just present it to you, and you can make of it what you will. I'm in this whole talk, I am erring on the side of being more opinionated than just to make it more fun. But this one I do actually believe. Here's one other thing about related work. In a related work section, some people think that their goal is to make other people's work look bad, right? So they can make their work look good, right? Green and white did this work, it was completely useless, right? And we're so much better, we're faster, we're smaller, we're better in every respect. They were idiots, really, right? But the truth is that it's not only is that not good scholarship, but it's almost certainly false, right? But also, it's like that credit is not like money. So Sarah here, Sarah, right? So if I have £100 and I give you £50, how much do I have left? 50, right? So I'm poorer and Sarah is richer. But if I have some love and I give you some love, do I have less love? No. Love is a sort of infinitely divisible resource. In fact, it grows the more you give it away. Isn't that wonderful? Kind of it's like, what's not to like? So credit is like that too, right? So giving credit to other people doesn't diminish the credit that your paper will get. You'll be judged on your new contributions. Saying nice things about other people does not mean that your contributions will be judged less good. Well, actually, to the contrary, right? So don't be sycophantic, don't sort of, but do take a moment to say not just antiseptic prose, say, in Sarah's inspiring paper of, 2006, she says this, and our work relates in that way. And just by adding a couple of adjectives for things that have genuinely illuminated or inspired, given you insights, you make the world a better place. And you give other people a signpost to say, actually, that paper of Sarah's is really worth a read. Right? Which also makes the world a better place. Because then people, it's like recommending systems. They tend to bubble up the ranking. So do not stint in your praise about other people. Because actually we do stand on the shoulders of giants. It's actually true. The other thing is, computer science is, because it has this multi-dimensional subject, it's very seldom you do a piece of work that is better than the competition in all dimensions. You know, you may be faster and smaller, but you're less secure. You know, you're better on X and Y and Z, but not on P and Q. Right? If you only mention X and Y and Z, and you simply fail to mention P and Q, what are you inviting your readers to do, your reviewers to do? You are inviting your reviewers to say, what about P and Q? Green and White's work is actually rather better in that sphere. You know, if the transactions are small, you know, everything's going to go, you're fine for big transactions, but when you've got lots and lots of small read-only transactions, your system is going to be absolutely terrible. Right? And you don't mention that. That's a very bad thing to allow a reviewer to say. If you say it, it's quite disarming to a reviewer. They cannot complain that as a criticism. They may say, overall, the contribution is not big enough. What they can't say is, they didn't appear to be aware of this problem. Right? So acknowledge your weaknesses. And the related work section is a good place to do that. Because it's part of saying, actually, you know, foo 98 is really rather good in this dimension. You should go read it. Okay? This is an easy lesson to deal with because it's, you know, it's all joy. Right. How are we doing? We have 10 minutes and 2 points. Oh, yes, sorry, you wanted to say something. Yeah?
Just before you go on.
Yeah.
This multidimensional thing, I found in a couple of the papers I've read and written, having a table that has all of the related work and all of the dimensions and that just puts in the beginning of the related work section, gives you this really fast reference where you go, oh, okay, they're good on these dimensions and not so good on these dimensions, and they are aware of all of the other people and how they fit into that space. And it's really compact and really easy to read.
A table with sort of rows and columns is very cool if you can, if your subject is well enough sliced and diced to do that. It isn't always. Something to avoid, though, is I've often read related work sections that simply has one sentence for other citations. It just simply says, you know, Foo and White did X. And then, you know, Brown and Green did Y. And you think, oh, so? Right? With no, in other words, there's no evaluative or value judgment stuff or comparison stuff done at all. That's a real shame. Right? So simply listing related work is not very cool. But that's quite separate to your point, which is if you can do a table, that's brilliant. Yeah. And sometimes very appropriate. Yes?
So you write, acknowledge weaknesses in your research, in your approach. And I've heard from some senior researchers that it actually can be the reason for rejection of your paper if you really honestly acknowledge all weaknesses of your approach.
Well, so the question is, if you acknowledge the weaknesses, mightn't that lead to your paper being rejected? I don't know. So if it's well reviewed, then the reviewer should spot those weaknesses, and it's worse if they identify them than if you do. So in your best case, then, you would have poor reviewers who don't spot the weaknesses, and your paper would slide into being published anyway. And that may be good for you personally, but it's not good for the field. So I'm not conscious of papers being rejected because they acknowledge their weaknesses. Sometimes it may be because having a clear understanding of what the contributions are and what they're not, you say the total net contribution is not big enough to justify publication in this journal or in this conference. That can happen, undoubtedly. So I think that's life, you know. You have to go for a less glamorous venue. Yeah.
Would a technique be to list your weaknesses in future works?
Yes, that's right. Yes, so you can often with related work you also say, and here are some things that I'm planning on doing. So we're actually not very good on small transactions, but we have 6 good ideas for how to do it, and we're working away hard on it. That's often a good positive spin to put, but it's probably even true. Yeah. An additional merit of papers. Oh, okay, yeah.
You seem to be sort of introducing a bit of a paradox because sort of the paper is about sort of celebrating your great idea, and now kind of also balancing with that, acknowledging your weaknesses.
That's not a paradox, right? I think you can be massively enthusiastic about the thing that you have spent your last, 6 months or maybe 3 years of your life working on, while being realistic about the fact that it's not going to cure world hunger. You know, I don't think these are incompatible. You can be enthusiastic about things that are not yet perfect. That's fine. That's called being human. Yeah.
So you said earlier that it's a good idea to write positive things about the giants
Yes.
that you stand on. A lot of scientific writing steer you away from writing this in a descriptive way. You know, you can't say something. I've been inspired by so and so, or things along these lines, because it's not considered professional to do so. And it makes you sort of look like you're sucking up to someone. You know, saying that, you know, I'm inspired by you. I mean, they could be very well be your reviewers, or we don't know.
So, indeed, often the assumption is that scientific writing should be somehow very, what's the word, passive and unemotional. Indeed, people sometimes say that you should write in the passive voice. An experiment was performed, rather than I performed this experiment. I always write in the first person. An experiment was performed. It just makes you want to lose the will to live. So, but as far as this kind of stuff is, I would err on the side. I mean, obviously you don't just want to suck up to people, right? But so you'd have to say, I did find it inspiring. It's true, right? If you're just saying it to be nice to the reviewer, don't do that, right? So just say it how it is in your heart. I think if you speak with your own voice and you're speaking the truth in love, then you'll get a long way.
So I just realized it's only 5 minutes.
I know,
We've got a couple more points, right?
No, 2 more points, right.
Yeah.
So very, very quickly, fast forward, right? 2 more points, which we will finish by noon, absolutely, without doubt. No, we will not. No, it's very bad practice, as I'm about to tell you in Thursday's talk. Put your readers first. What does this mean? Here is what many people do when they when they finally get to the payload of their paper. They start with something like this. You know, they draw a deep breath and say, consider a bifurcated semi-lattice. I'm sure that such a thing doesn't exist. Because what they've done is, they've done a lot of work. They work through examples and so forth, and then they for some general idea, and they present the general idea first. This is bad, right? This feels like good scholarship again, but it's very poor presentation. Right, so you've got to just remember that when you're talking about your readers, you want to convey the intuition first. When I was within Marco with my whiteboard, I did not write up this, right? I said, here's an example. Right, I said, and I sort of tried to convey to him the intuition. So again, the initial stages of your paper should be to convey the intuition, leaving the formality and the details and all the Greek symbols for a little bit later in the paper. I would always start with examples and move on to generality, and almost never start with generality and then illustrate with examples. That's my suggestion to you. I mean, and here's an example of me doing just that in a paper that I wrote a little while ago. So this is part of the background section. I'm trying to set the scene. This isn't my idea yet. I'm setting the scene, but I set the scene by starting with an example program right away. The other thing about putting your readers first is that when you are writing a paper that's the result of quite a lot of work, you have been through many blind alleys, right? So your temptation is to carry your readers down the blind alleys because they are drenched in your blood, right? You spent hours down that blind alley. So you take your reader down, and this doesn't happen very often, but I have read papers in which I have struggled through 2 pages of technical material. I'm a reviewer, right, so I feel I have to read it. And at the end of the 2 pages of technical material, I get to the point at which he says, this turned out to be not a good idea. In the next section, we present a much better... I think, give me a break, right? You sort of tortured me for 2 pages, and now you tell me it was all for nothing? Your role as an author is to point out the heifer, say, there's a very big, painful place. Don't go there, right? And lead me swiftly past. The only exception to this is when there is a place that is so obvious, like you're in a maze and you're leading the reader through the maze, and there's a big door that says exit, right, and you lead them straight past. And they're thinking, right? That's bad for your readers too. You have to say, look, this door here marked exit turns out not to work well. So you may have to make a brief digression, but only for things that are so obvious that they'll be distracting if you don't. So this is very... concentrate on your readers always and follow them to the end. Last thing, in the last 120 seconds, listen to your readers, by which I mean get people to read your paper and get feedback from them. So particularly your friends, right? So your friends are like guinea pigs. So what's your name?
Mo.
right? Most. So supposing Most is a good friend of mine, then I'm going to inoculate him with the drug that is my paper, and I'm going to listen for what kind of squeaking noises he makes and how quickly he dies, right? But you have to tell your friends what you're going to do, right? You don't want, if you left to themselves, they will tell you about spelling mistakes and grammar. This is not what you want to know. What you want to know is, I got lost on page 3, right? They will not tell you this unless they are told very explicitly that that's what you want, because they will get to page 3, they will get lost, and they'll think, I'm just too stupid. Simon's a very clever fellow, and most thinks that, this paper obviously wasn't for me. Well done, Simon, great paper. You misspelt this thing on page 2. It's very important to tell your friends what you want to know is where you got lost, and then you eyeball them. Most comes to my office, or I go to Moses' office more likely, and I said, where did you get lost on page 3? And he says, what, you got lost? And then I say, oh, but it's like this. And then Moses says, now I understand. And then I just have to remember what I said and put that in the paper, right? So it's a feedback loop that you must do repeatedly. You can read this slide about getting expert help. Later, but I just want to say one thing about reading reviews. So when you get reviews back for your rejected paper, you will think, those bastards, they have no clue. Those referees, they have no idea about this subject. They're ignorant, and so you'll bleed, right? You just set them aside. A week later, you come back, and you have to try to read the review in such a way, you want to say, how could I rephrase this paper so that not even the stupidest reviewer could make that mistake? That's your goal, is to be so clear that even stupid people could not make that mistake. And the other half of it is to remember that the reviewer has done something really amazing, right? They have given for you something that is not like love, a completely non-fungible commodity, their own personal time. They have spent an hour that they will never ever get back in your service. Don't you think that's quite amazing? A stranger who you may never meet, or certainly, you may never know who they are. They have given you an hour that they will never recover, and they've devoted it purely to you. So think about that. And when you read the review, think about it in that way. And if you ever meet a reviewer, regardless of what they said, thank them. If you do get to meet them, say, how could you help me write this better? You get the idea. It's really hard to do. It's very, very hard to do because they really have got the wrong end of the stick. But nevertheless, you must do this. It's the key to getting constructive information from your reviews. And there we are, 7 things. That's all you've got to do. And then so the good news is that I think if you do just these 7 things, you'll make a marked improvement of your paper that you'll put it above the herd rather than below the herd. And that's always good, right? Because then you get published as well. But most of these things are things that are good for the world too, because they communicate more clearly and more accurately and spread love. So there you are.
Thank you.
Good.
So we'll hear Simon again on Thursday afternoon when you talk about research talks.
Yep.
There's probably time for a couple of quick questions. Otherwise, I'm sure there'll be opportunity in the course of the week to ask Simon when he hopefully attends some of our lunch sessions.
Yeah, I'm going to stick around for lunch today. I'm not here tomorrow, unfortunately.
Okay. Is there any sort of quick questions at the end?
Yeah, over here. Yeah. Do you want to give a microphone? Yeah.
There are some papers who would have discussion section. Do you like discussion section?
A discussion section, what's it discussing? You mean discussing related work? Or?
They just call it discussion, and they usually say the weaknesses of their systems, and it's kind of discussion together with related work.
So discussion might be sort of, okay, so now we've seen the idea, let's stand back a bit and compare with alternative approaches and how it might fit into. So it's a bit like related work, perhaps a bit more broadly. So that can be good, right? So because at that stage you're thinking, well, okay, so I've presented you one specific, right? So now you've got a bit more intellectual scaffolding, but there are many variations of this that we might have chosen but didn't. So often it fits in with the related work section. So yes, if it makes sense, do it. Yeah, and if you'd like to read it, if you're a reader of the paper, then go for it. Yep, Mos.
You said write in the first person.
Yes.
I versus we, is that just...
Oh, yes. Write in the first person. Do you say I or we? I usually say we. And it's easy because I almost invariably co-author papers. Even with a single author paper, I think we is a bit less sort of drawing attention to myself. even though it's sort of technically like the royal we, the Queen does it, and single-authored papers sometimes do it. But also, sometimes you mean we meaning myself and you, the reader. We are now going to look at together. We're standing alongside the reader. That's a good thing to convey if you can. Yeah.
Because the reviews are so important to improve the paper, should you ever submit a paper knowing that it will be rejected just to get reviews to improve it for the next one?
Should you ever submit a paper that you know will be rejected just to get reviews? Well, I think so. Reviewing is an expensive process, right? To which, as I've been referring, reviewers are devoting their most precious commodity. So I would be very cautious about submitting papers that you know have deficiencies that you could fix and want to fix if you had a bit more time. So I think that's kind of gaming the system. I'd encourage you not to do that. Wait until you've got a paper that you're actually proud of. It may not be perfect, because you can always make it better. So it's a bit of a continuum here. But don't do something that you know has major deficiencies. That's a bit naughty because, your poor reviewers, what do you want them to do? You're burning up their cycles. Nobody will ever call you on it, but you shouldn't do it, I think.
Okay, time to close the session,
Yeah.
I think. Thank you.
So I'm going to stick around for lunch. We'll do a chat over lunch. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Pleasure.
Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.